My name is Father Rick Petticourt, and as president of Aquinas Institute of Theology, it's a pleasure to welcome you today. I think this is one of our bigger crowds for the Aquinas Lecture. This is the academic event of the year that we sponsor at Aquinas Institute. Once a year, as a School of Theology and Ministry, we bring to our institution for not only our own students, but for the good of the St. Louis region, a thinker of great repute, someone who has something meaningful to say about theology, philosophy, the arts, human life in general. And today it is, for me, a great privilege to preside, as it were, at this event with Dr. Elenore Stump as our speaker. Elenore is someone who is very near and dear to this institution and to the Dominican family, not only in St. Louis, but truly around the entire world. And to help you to get to know Dr. Stump a little bit better, Father Dominic Holtz, Assistant Professor of Church History, is going to give the formal introduction. So, Father Dominic.
A few years ago, my friar, who was, to be sure, a dear friend of our speaker this afternoon, dubbed her the world's most improbable Thomist. So taken was she with this title that she inscribed it forever in memory in the foreword of her compendious and insightful study of the Angelic Doctor, simply titled Aquinas. At the time the phrase was uttered, and perhaps even now, there was some merit in conceiving Dr. Elenore Stump's identity as a Thomist as improbable. A married woman with children, at the time a Protestant living in North America, did not sit so perfectly or predictably well with the stereotype of a Thomist, a religious cleric on the continent embodying the distillation of Catholic orthodoxy and identity. All the same, with all due respect to my former superior, I am not altogether sure that Eleanor's Thomism is all that improbable. From the beginnings, her studies placed her at the heart of Thomas's insight, namely the priority of God's revealed and inspired Word, earning degrees in both classical languages from Grinnell and biblical studies from Harvard. It was from this foundational encounter of human persons and divine love in literature and scripture that Elenore turned to the study of philosophy, earning both her master's and doctoral degrees in medieval philosophy at Cornell University. From then, like the patron of our school and this lecture series, Elenore has published and spoken publicly at an enviable, even dizzying pace in a wide array of topics: logic and epistemology, biblical inspiration and eternity, faith and atonement, persons and moral freedom, justification and love. Her teaching has quite literally spanned the globe, across the United States, of course, but also from Aberdeen to Frankfurt, from Oxford to Rome, and from here in St. Louis as the Robert J. Henley Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University, to Wuhan in the People's Republic of China. Her participation in the work of the Academy is equally as impressive, rendering continuous service to committees and advisory boards across the globe, but especially to the work of the American Philosophical Association and the American Catholic Philosophical Association. All the same, even as our brother Thomas was at least as valued for his fraternal service in the Order of Preachers as for his large-scale contributions, we here in St. Louis, and all the more at St. Dominic Priory, have come to see Eleanor's very personal, human engagement with her study. For those of us who know her, there is something altogether fitting, indeed I would say probable, that the woman who can parse the moral teachings of biblical narratives in her different lectures is the same woman as the one who guides our common reading and enjoyment of Dante's Comedy on Saturdays over Danish and coffee, and indeed the one who presents her ever-hungry Dominican brothers with gracious treats for the holidays. This latter point is not trivial nor unexpected. While much of Eleanor's work has been an exploration of the problem of evil, her engagement with Thomist has led her to consider always the personal dimensions of that problem. How personal relationship is crucial to our knowing and our understanding. Indeed, how love, real love for real persons in their concrete lives with their personal hopes and dreams, is and must be at the heart of any truly Christian account of suffering. It is out of this project of giving reasons for the hope that is in us, with the best philosophy, whether medieval or contemporary, have to offer, that we have gathered here this afternoon. Sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen, with great satisfaction, I present to you the 2009 Aquinas Lecturer, Elenore Stump, in her presentation of her paper, Desires of the Heart, a Tertium Quid.
I was going to say as my opening line, I'm grateful to Rick Petticord and Aquinas Institute for inviting me, and I was going to say, I'm gracious to Dominic Post for his generous introduction, and I would have said that no matter what he said. But I want you to know that I think that's the best introduction I ever had, one of my favorite, and it shows why I care so much about the Dominican community, which can be literate, elegant, and human all at the same time. So I'm grateful that you're here. I see a lot of friends. I see a lot of students in the audience. I see my much beloved Dominicans, also my much beloved Jesuits. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here, and I'm impressed that all you folks would troop out on a wintry Sunday afternoon to hear a lecture. You should have a handout. If you don't have a handout and the person sitting next to you has a handout, make them share. The problem of evil is raised by the existence of suffering in the world. Can it be true that a world which has such suffering in it is also a world that's governed by an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God, as Christians believe? A theodicy is one way to answer this question in the affirmative. A theodicy is an attempt to show that there's a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. In the history of the discussions of the problem of evil, a lot of effort has been expended on proposing or attacking theodicies and the morally sufficient reasons which theodicies propose. Generally, when a theodicy proposes a morally sufficient reason that explains why God allows suffering, that reason is centered on some benefit which couldn't be gotten without the suffering and which outweighs it. And the benefit is most commonly thought of as some intrinsically valuable thing essential to general human flourishing. So, for example, for those of you who study theology, the well-known theologian John Hitt has proposed a soul-making theodicy. It justifies suffering as building the character of the sufferer, and by that means contributing to the flourishing of the sufferer. Or for the philosophers among you, the well-known philosopher Richard Swinburne has argued that suffering contributes to the flourishing of sufferers because in suffering a person is useful to others, and being useful to others is an important part of human flourishing. Scholars who have attacked theodicies such as these have argued that the proposed benefit could have been gotten without the suffering, or that the suffering is not a morally acceptable means to the benefit. But these attacks on theodicy share with theodicy an assumption that I want to call in question here. Both the attacks and the theodicy suppose that a person's flourishing in one way or another would be sufficient to justify God in allowing that person's suffering, if only the suffering and the flourishing were connected in the right way. I don't think that's right. That's the assumption I want to call in question here. I don't think that human suffering can be justified only in terms of the intrinsically valuable things which make for human flourishing, however we understand that flourishing. And that's because human beings can set their hearts on things which are not necessary for flourishing. And they suffer when they lose or fail to get what they set their hearts on. That suffering also needs to be addressed in consideration of the problem of unity. The suffering to which I want to call attention can be thought of in terms of what the psalmist calls the desires of the heart. When the psalmist says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart," we all have some idea what the psalmist is promising. We are clear, for example, that some abstract theological good, which a person doesn't care much about, doesn't count as one of the desires of that person's heart. Suffering also arises when a human being fails to get a desire of her heart, or has and then loses the desire of her heart. I don't know how to make the notion of a desire of the heart precise, but clearly we do have some intuitive grasp of it, and we commonly use the expression or others related to it in ordinary discourse. We say, for example, that a person is heartsick because he's lost his heart's desire. He's filled with heartache because his heart's desire is kept from him. He loses his heart because something he had put his heart into is taken from him. It would have been different for him if he'd wanted it only half-heartedly, but since it was what he had at heart, he's likely to be heartsore a long time over the loss of it. Unless, of course, he has a change of heart about it. And so on and so on. Perhaps we could say that a person's heart's desire is a particular kind of commitment on her part to something, a person or a project, which matters greatly to her, but which is not essential to her flourishing. So, for example, consider the wife of Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King. Her life exemplifies flourishing on any ordinary measure of human flourishing. And yet her husband's assassination was undoubtedly heartbreaking for her. Sometimes philosophers talk about our beliefs as a connected web, with some beliefs peripheral and others central to the web. Maybe there's also a web of desire. The desire of a person's heart is a desire which is at or near the center of the web of desire for her. If she loses what she wants when her desire is at or near the center of the web, then other things which she had wanted begin to lose their ability to attract her, because what she had most centrally wanted is gone. The web of desire starts to fall apart when the center doesn't hold, you might say. And that's why the ordinary good things of life, like food and work, fail to draw a person who has lost the desires of her heart. She's heartbroken, we say, and that's why she has no desire for anything else now. If things essential to human flourishing are intrinsically valuable for all human beings, then those things which are the desires of the heart can be thought of as the things which have value for a particular person just because she set her heart on it. Think about the value a child has for her mother. A mother doesn't love her child because she thinks the child is intrinsically valuable. It's the other way around. The child is infinitely valuable in her mother's life because the mother loves the child so much. In the same way, the value a heart's desire has for a person is derivative from her love for it and not the other way around. A loving father, could be said he was a philosopher, but still, a loving father who was trying to deal gently with his small daughter's tantrums, said to her with exasperated adult feeling finally, "It's not reasonable to cry about these things." Presumably the father means that the things for which his little daughter was weeping didn't have much value on the scale which measures the intrinsic value of good things essential to human flourishing. And no doubt he was right in that assessment. But there's another scale by which to measure too, and that's the scale which measures the value a thing has for a particular person because of the love she has for it. The second scale can't be reduced to the first. We don't care just about human flourishing. We also care about those things which are the desires of our hearts. And we suffer when we're denied our heart's desire. I would say that it's not reasonable to say to a weeping child that it's not reasonable to weep about the loss of things on which she set her heart. Suffering which stems from a loss of the heart's desire is often enough compatible with flourishing. So think, for example, of women who were slaves at the time when slavery was legal in this country. Think of Sojourner Truth, who was sold away from her parents when she was 9. Or think of Harriet Tubman, who suffered permanent neurological damage from the beating she sustained in adolescence. If any human lives exemplify flourishing, the lives of these women manifestly do. Most people would suppose that each of these women is an exemplar of a highly admirable, meaningful human life. And surely, nonetheless, each of these women was irrevocably deprived of something on which, at some time, she had set her heart. Thinkers in varying cultures, including some Stoics, Buddhists, Maoists, and many in the Christian tradition, have been fiercely committed to the position that human flourishing is independent of the vicissitudes of fortune that cause heartbreak. On Aquinas' worldview, which takes flourishing to be a matter of union with God, most of the evils a human being suffers are compatible with flourishing. And that's because a human person can be in a relationship of love with God and can also experience the consolation of that relationship, even when she's afflicted with serious suffering of body or of mind. For all these thinkers, human flourishing is compatible even with such things as the depredations of other human beings, the torment of pain and disfigurement, the anguish of mental illness, the wretchedness of impoverishment, the misery of being unwanted, the affliction of pariah status, the brokenness of shame, and the death of loved ones. That any of these things is sufficient to cause heartbreak to the person suffering. The belief that flourishing is compatible with heartbrokenness is also common among the reflective in our own culture. So, for example, in a moving passage, born of his own long experience in caring for and living with the severely disabled, Jean Vanier says about the disabled and also about himself, he says, "We can only accept the pain in our lives if we discover our true self beneath all the masks and realize that if we are broken, we are also more beautiful than we ever dared to suspect. When we realize our brokenness, we do not have to fall into depression. Seeing our own brokenness and beauty allows us to recognize hidden under the brokenness and self-centeredness of others, their beauty, their value, and their sacredness. This discovery is a blessed moment, a moment of grace, and a moment of enlightenment that comes in a meeting with the God of love, who reveals to us that we are beloved, and so is everyone else. We can start to live the pain of loss and accept anguish because a new love and a new consciousness of self are being given to us." A particularly poignant example of this kind of view is given by John Hope in his memoir about his slow descent into blindness. Hull spends many pages documenting his powerful aversion to going blind and the great suffering caused him by the blindness that finally enveloped him completely. But then in his book he recounts a religious experience he had while he was listening to music in a church. As he describes that experience, he summarizes his attitude towards his blindness in this powerful passage. He says, "The thought keeps coming back to me. Could there be a strange way in which blindness is a dark, paradoxical gift? Does it offer a way of life, a purification, an economy? Is it really like a painful purging through a death If blindness is a gift, it is not one that I would wish on anybody. But as the whole place and my mind were filled with that wonderful music, I found myself saying, I accept the gift. I accept the gift. I was filled with a profound sense of worship. I felt that I was in the very presence of God, that the giver of the gift had drawn near to me to inspect his handiwork. If I hardly dared approach him, he hardly dared approach me. He had, as it were, thrown his cloak of darkness around me from a distance, but had now drawn near to seek a kind of reassurance from me that everything was all right, that he had not misjudged the situation, that he did not have to stay. It's all right, I was saying to him. There's no need to wait. Go on, you can go on now. Everything's fine. And everything is fine. In some sense, having to do with relationship to God, and so with flourishing too. On Aquinas' account of flourishing, as well as on John Hope's. I have no wish to undercut anything in this moving passage. Hope's thought, like the thought of Jean Bonnier, seems to me to be as true as it is moving. But because things can be fine in this sense, even for those who suffer greatly, the stern-minded thinkers of the world suppose that a person who's suffering because of the loss of the desires of his heart just needs to let those desires go. Now there is something to be said for the stern-minded attitude. Ordinarily, a parent's goodness is not impugned if the parent refuses to provide for the child anything, whatever, which the child sets its heart on. A child could set its heart on things very destructive to it, or even on evil things. And no doubt this is only the beginning of a list of such very problematic instances of heart's desires. In such cases, even if it were possible to do so, a good parent wouldn't give the child what the child desires just because the parent loves the child and wants what's best for the child. A mother can get cross purposes with her child just because she cares as much as she does that the child flourish. And of course, an analogous point holds with regard to God and the suffering of adult human beings. In cases in which the desires of a person's heart are seriously inimical to his flourishing, reasonable people are unlikely to suppose that some explanation is needed for a good God's failure to give that person the desires of his heart. But if we exclude all such cases, there nonetheless remain many instances in which a person is heartbroken in consequence of having set his heart in humanly understandable and entirely appropriate ways on something whose value for him is derivative of his love for it. Even with regard to this restricted class of cases, stern-minded thinkers suppose that as long as flourishing is preserved, the desires of the heart should be abandoned if cleaving to them leads to suffering. For stern-minded thinkers, there is no good reason why God should provide whatever goods not necessary for her flourishing a human person has fixed her heart on. You can think about their position this way. Stern-minded thinkers take human flourishing to be a very great good. For those who think of flourishing as a relationship to God, it can seem an infinite good, or a good too great to be commensurable with any other good. If God provides this good for a human person, then on the stern-minded attitude, that is or ought to be enough for that person. A person who doesn't find this greatest of all good good enough, on the view of the stern-minded, is like somebody who wins the lottery, but is unhappy because she didn't get exactly what she wanted for her birthday. In effect, then, the stern-minded attitude is unwilling to assign a positive value to anything which is not essential to a person's flourishing. Consequently, the stern-minded attitude is, at best, unwilling to accord any value to the desires of the heart, and at worst, eager to get rid of those desires themselves. Now, a stern-minded attitude is persistent in the history of Christian thought from the patristic period onward. In its patristic form, it can be seen vividly in the story which Cassian tells about a monk named Paternotus. It's worth quoting at length the heart-rendingly horrible story which Cassian recounts with so much oblivious admiration. Here's what Cassian says. He says, Paternotus's constant perseverance in his request to be admitted into the monastery finally induced the monks to receive him, along with his little son, who was about 8 years old, to test Paternotus and see if he would be more moved by family affection and the love of his own brood than by the obedience and mortification of Christ, which every monk should prefer to his love. The monks deliberately neglected the child, dressed him in rags, and even subjected the child to cuffs and slaps, which the father saw some of them inflict on the innocent for no reason, so that the father never saw his son without the son's cheeks being marked by the signs of tears. Although he saw the child being treated like this day after day before his eyes, the father's feelings remained firm and unmoving for the love of Christ. The superior of the monastery decided to test the father's strength of mind still further. One day, when he noticed the child weeping, he pretended to be enraged at the child and ordered the father to pick up his son and throw him into the Nile River. The father, as if the command had been given him by our Lord, at once ran and snatched up his son and carried him in his own arms to the river bank to throw him in. And the deed would have been done had not some of the brethren been stationed in advance to watch the river bank carefully. As the child was thrown, they caught him. Thus they prevented the command, performed as it was by the father's obedience and devotion, from having any effect. That's the story. Cassian plainly prizes Paternotus' actions and desires, but surely, most of us would find them chilling and reprehensible. What Cassian admires in Paternotus is, in fact, the determination with which Paternotus tries to stamp out in himself one of the most powerful and natural of all heart's desires, in the interest of focusing all his care solely on his own flourishing, spiritually understood. An attitude similar to Cassian's, but less appalling, can still be found more than a millennium later in some texts, but not others, of the work of Teresa of Avila, to take just one example from among a host of thinkers who might have been selected as examples. Writing to her sister nuns, Teresa says, "Oh, how desirable is the union with God's will. Happy the soul that has reached it. Such a soul will live tranquilly in this life and in the next as well. Nothing in earthly events afflicts it, unless it finds itself in some danger of losing God, neither sickness, nor poverty, nor death. For this soul sees well that the Lord knows what he is doing better than the soul knows what it is desiring. But alas for us, how few there must be who reach union with God's will. I tell you, I am writing this with much pain upon seeing myself so far away from such union, and all through my own fault. Don't think the matter lies in my being so conformed to the will of God that if my father or brother dies, I don't feel it, or that if there are trials or sicknesses, I suffer them happily. That is, not feeling it when your father dies, not weeping over his death, is, in Teresa's view here, a good spiritual condition which she is not yet willing to attribute to herself. Teresa is here echoing a tradition which finds its prime medieval exemplar in Augustine's Confessions. There Augustine says that at the death of his mother, by a powerful command of his will, he kept himself from weeping at her funeral, only to disgrace himself in his own eyes later by weeping copiously in private. In the same text from which I just quoted, Teresa emphasizes the importance of love of neighbor. But in fact, it does not seem possible for the love of neighbor to cohere with the stern-minded attitude trying to be manifested by Teresa and Augustine in the face of the death, real or imagined, of a beloved parent. For Aquinas, who has the best account of love I know, it's the nature of love to desire the good of the beloved and to desire union with the beloved. But the desire for the good of the beloved is frustrated if the beloved gets sick and dies. Or, if the stern-minded attitude is unwilling to concede that point, then this much is incontrovertible even on the stern-minded attitude. The desire for union with the beloved is frustrated when the beloved dies, and so is absent. One way or another, then, the desires of love are frustrated when the beloved dies. Consequently, there is something bad or lamentable, something worth tears, something whose loss brings affliction with it, about the death of any person whom one loves, one's father, one's brother, or even one's neighbor, whom one is bound to love too, as Teresa acknowledges. Unmoved tranquility at the death of another person is therefore incompatible with love of that person. To the extent to which one loves another person, one cannot be unmoved at his death. And so, contrary to what the stern-minded thinkers suppose, love of neighbor is in fact incompatible with the stern-minded attitude. Teresa's attitude toward her father's death, as she imagines it might be if it were what she takes to be ideal, that attitude can be usefully contrasted with Bernard of Clairvaux's attitude toward the death of his brother. Commenting on his grief at that death, Bernard says to his religious community, he says, "You, my son, know how deep my sorrow is, how galling a wound it leaves." And addressing himself, he says, "Flow on, my tears, flow on. Let my tears gush forth like fountains." Reflecting on his own unwillingness to repudiate his great sorrow over his brother's death, his failure, that is, to follow Augustine's model, Bernard says, "It is but human and necessary that we respond to our friend with feeling, that we be happy in their company, disappointed in their absence. Social intercourse, especially between friends, cannot be purposeless. The reluctance to part and the yearning for each other when separated indicate how meaningful their mutual love must be when they are together." And Bernard is hardly the only figure in the Christian tradition who fails to accept and affirm Cassion's attitude. Aquinas is another. So, for example, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, Aquinas wants to explain why Christ told his disciples that he was going to God the Father as a means of comforting the disciples at the prospect of being separated from Christ. In trying to explain this passage in the Gospel, Aquinas says it's common among friends to be less sad over the absence of a friend when that friend is going to something which exalts him. And that's why the Lord gives them this reason for his leaving, in order to console them. Unlike Teresa, who repudiates grief at the prospect of losing her father, in his general reflection here, as in many other places, Aquinas is accepting the appropriateness of a person's grief at the loss of a loved person, and he's validating the need for consolation for such grief. So Aquinas is not to be ranked among the members of the stern-minded group any more than Bernard is, and of course in other moods when she's not self-consciously evaluating her own spiritual progress, Teresa herself sounds more like Bernard and Aquinas than she does like Passion. On this subject, then, the Christian tradition is of two minds. Not all its influential figures stand with Passion on this score, and even among those who do, many are double-minded about it. But somebody will surely object, look, isn't it part of Christian doctrine that God allows the death of any person who dies? Does anybody die when God wills that that person live? So when a person dies on Christian theology, isn't it the will of God that that person die? In what sense then could Teresa be united with God in will if she grieved over her father's death? How could she be united with God as she wants to be if her will is frustrated in what God's will commands? In my view, the position presupposed by these questions rests on too simple an understanding of God's will and union with God's will. To see why, assume that at death, Teresa's father is united with God in heaven. Then the death of Teresa's father has opposite effects for Teresa and for God. It unites Teresa's father permanently with God, but it keeps Teresa from union with her father, at least for the remainder of Teresa's earthly life. For this reason, love's desire for union with the beloved can't be fulfilled in the same way for a human person as for God. If Teresa's will is united with God's will in desiring union with her father, then Teresa's will must also be frustrated at the very event, her father's dying, which fulfills God's will in this respect. Something analogous can be said about the other desire of love, for the good of the beloved. If Teresa desires the good of her father, she can only desire what her own mind sees as that good. But unlike God's mind, her mind's ability to see the good is obviously limited. To the extent to which Teresa's will is united with God's will in desiring the good of the beloved, then Teresa will also desire for the beloved person things different from those desired by God, in virtue of Teresa's differing ability to see the good for the beloved person. Now it's easy to become confused here because the phrase the good can be used in two different ways. And here I need a philosopher's distinction. I put it on your handout to give you a helping hand. Philosophers call these two different ways the attributive use of the expression and the referential use of the expression. An expression like the good of the beloved can be used to refer to concrete particular things which are conducive to the beloved's well-being. And in that case, the expression is being used referentially to refer to some stuff. Or the expression can be used opaquely to pick out anything whatever, as long as it's under the description, the good of the beloved. And then the expression is being used attributively. So here is an attributive use. A mother who's baffled by the quarrels among her adult children and clueless about how to bring about a just peace for them, she may say despairingly, I just want the good for everybody. She is then using the expression the good attributively with no idea about how to use it referentially. That's the idea. If Teresa were tranquil over any affliction which happens to her father, it would be because she thought that by this tranquility her will would be united to God's will in willing the good for her father. In this thought of hers, the good is being used attributively to designate whatever God thinks is good. But this can't be the way the good is used in any thought of God. It's not true that God desires as the good of a beloved person whatever it is that God desires for him. When God desires the good for someone, he desires it by desiring concrete particular things as good. Consequently, when we say that God desires the good for a person, the expression the good is used referentially. For this reason, when in an effort to will what God wills, Teresa desires whatever happens to her father as the good for her father, she thereby actually fails to will what God wills. To be united with God and willing the good requires willing for the beloved, as God does, particular things which are in fact the good for the beloved. And doing so requires recognizing those things which constitute that good. And I realize that's complicated, and the boss of my department, that is my boss, he reminded me this morning that sometimes you can get a lot of mileage by doing things Plato's way. So, as Plato teaches us, it's easier to see a point about the psyche sometimes by thinking first in large terms about a whole society. So we can see the point I'm trying to make here by thinking about what happens in China after the death of its ruler Mao Zedong. At that point, there were many factions competing for power. The Chinese called one of these competing groups the whatever faction, because the members of that group were committed to maintaining as true anything Mao said, whatever it was, and to maintaining as good anything Mao had commanded, whatever that was. In trying to desire whatever happens as good because God wills it, a person is, as it were, trying to be a member of a whatever faction for God. She's trying to maintain as good anything that happens, whatever it is, on the grounds that it's what God wills. By contrast, in his great lament over the death of his brother, Bernard of Clairvaux was willing to affirm both his passionate grief over the loss of his brother and his acceptance of God's allowing that death. Bernard says, "Shall I find fault with God's judgment because I wince from the pain? I have no wish to repudiate the decrees of God, nor do I question that judgment by which each of us has received his due." So Bernard grieves over this particular death as a bad thing, even while he accepts that God's allowing this bad thing is a good thing. Understanding the subtle but very important difference in attitude between Teresa and Bernard on this score helps to elucidate an otherwise peculiar part of the book of Job. In the book of Job, God rebukes Job's comforters. God tells the comforters that they did not say of God the thing which is right, unlike God's servant Job, who did. But here's the peculiar part. What the comforters had said was that God is perfectly good and justified in allowing Job to suffer as he did. What Job had said, with bitterness, is that his suffering was bad and that God shouldn't have allowed it. How is it that in this story, God says that Job was right in what he said, and the comforters were wrong in what they said? In my view, the answer lies in seeing that the comforters took Job's suffering to be good just because, in their view, Job's suffering was willed by God. In effect, the sufferers were and wanted to be part of the whatever faction of God. Job, by contrast, was intransigent in his refusal to be partisan in this way. And so, on the apparently paradoxical view of the book of Job, in opposing God, Job is more aligned with God's will than the comforters are. That's why, when in the story God comes to adjudicate between Job and the comforters, he sides with Job, who had opposed him, and not with the comforters who are trying to be God's partisans. The apparent paradox here can be resolved by the Thomistic distinction between God's antecedent and his consequent will. I have this on the handout for you too. Roughly put, God's antecedent will is what God would have willed if things in the world had been up to God alone. God's consequent will is what God in fact wills, given what God's creatures will. God's consequent will is his will for the greatest good available in the circumstances, when a lot of those circumstances have been generated by the misuse of human free will. You can see this distinction very nicely if you think of mothers and 2-year-olds. When you want to have a happy family dinner hour with your 2-year-old, you're operating on your antecedent will. When you send a 2-year-old to his room yelling and screaming because he won't stop throwing his food on the floor, you're operating on your consequent will. On this distinction, whatever happens in the world happens only because it's in accordance with God's will, all right. But that will is God's consequent will. God's consequent will, however, is different from his antecedent will, and many of the things which happen in the world are not in accordance with God's antecedent will. To try to be in accord with God's will by taking as acceptable, as unworthy of sorrow, everything that happens, is to confuse the consequent will of God with the antecedent will. It's to accept as intrinsically good even those things which God wills only in his consequent will. But the distinction between God's antecedent and his consequent will is meant to help us understand God does not will as intrinsically good everything he wills. What he wills in his consequent will might be only what is the best in the circumstances, and the best available in the circumstances might be only the lesser of two evils. And so to accept as good whatever happens on the grounds that it is God's will is the wrong way to try to be united with God. One can desire as intrinsically good what one's own mind takes to be intrinsically good in the circumstances, or one can desire as intrinsically good whatever happens on the grounds that it is God's will. But only the desire for what one's own mind takes to be intrinsically good can be in accordance with God's will. And for the same reason, only a desire of this sort is conducive to union with God. Although it appears paradoxical, then, the closest a human person may be able to come in this life to uniting her will with God's will may include her willing those things, say that a beloved person not God, which are opposed to God's consequent will. Something also needs to be said in this connection about the Christian doctrine which mandates denial of the self. This much understanding of the two different ways in which one can try to will what God wills shows that there are also two different interpretations of that doctrine. Passion and others who hold a stern-minded attitude manifest one such understanding. A person who shares Passion's attitude will attempt to deny himself by, in effect, refusing to let his own mind and his own will exercise their characteristic functions. That's because a person who attempts to see as good whatever happens, on the grounds that whatever happens is willed by God, that person is trying to suppress his own understanding of the good. And a person who attempts to will as good whatever happens on the same grounds is trying to suppress the desires his own will forms, or trying not to acquire the desires his own will would have formed if he weren't in the grip of that stern-minded attitude. To attempt to deny the self in a stern-minded way is thus to try not to have a self at all. A woman who says sincerely to her father, I want only what you want, and whatever you think is good in my view too, that's a woman who's trying to be at one with her father by having no self of her own. A little reflection shows that contrary to first appearances, the no self position is actually incompatible with Christ's command to take one's cross daily and deny oneself. That's because you can't crucify a self you don't have. To crucify yourself is to have desires and to be willing to act counter to them. C.S. Lewis, in a passage in which he's arguing for a similar position, he puts the point this way. He says, it wouldn't be possible to live from moment to moment, willing nothing but submission to God as such. What would the material for such submission be? It seems to be self-contradictory to say, what I will is to subject what I will to God's will, because that what I will has no content. An adherent to the whatever faction of God can't deny himself, because he's constructed his desires in such a way that whatever he wills, he doesn't will counter to his own desires. That's because a person who's a partisan of whatever faction has only an overarching desire for whatever it may be that's God's will. And he's attempting to stamp out of himself any desires which are in conflict with that one overarching desire. He doesn't want to let God's desires take precedence over his own. He just wants to have no desires of his own. That's why, unlike the real Teresa, who is full of very human emotions and desires, that's why such a person wouldn't weep if her father died. For a person in the grip of a clear-minded attitude, whatever happens is in accordance with the one overarching desire to will whatever God wills. And so whatever happens isn't the source of sorrow to her. In virtue of the fact that she's trying to stamp out of herself all desires except that one desire for whatever it is that may be God's will, she's trying to have no desires which are frustrated by anything that happens. By contrast, a self-crucifying denier of the self has desires for things his own intellect finds good. And that's why he's vulnerable to grief and the frustration of those desires. But he prefers his grief and his frustration to willing what is opposed to God's will. And that's the sense in which he wills that God's will be done. His desire is that God's desires take precedence over his own. When Jesus says to God the Father, "Not my will, but yours be done," he is not expressing the no-self position. On the contrary, as Aquinas argues in his commentary on that passage, in this line, Jesus is acknowledging that he has desires of his own and that they may be in conflict with God's desires. That in virtue of his preferring his suffering to the violation of God's will, Jesus is willing that God's desires take precedence over his. And that's the sense in which he's willing that God's will be done. C.S. Lewis says, in order to submit the will to God, we must have a will. And that will must have objects. Christian renunciation does not mean stoic apathy. It means a readiness to prefer God to inferior ends, even when those ends are in themselves lawful. Jesus brought to Gethsemane a will and a strong will to escape suffering and death if such escape were compatible with the Father's will. And he also combined that with a perfect readiness for obedience if it wasn't. To deny oneself, therefore, is a matter of being willing both to have desires of one's own and to go contrary to them. Or, put another way, it's a matter of being willing to suffer the violation of one's will. Insofar as the stern-minded attitude seeks to eradicate desires other than the desire for flourishing, the stern-minded attitude in effect refuses to have a self to deny. And so it's more aptly characterized as an extreme attempt to avoid suffering rather than a self-denial. So for all these reasons, I think the stern-minded attitude is to be repudiated. Whatever its antiquity and ancestry, like many others in the Christian tradition, Aquinas does not accept it. And in my view, Aquinas does well to reject it. It's an unpalatable position, even from the point of view of an ascetically minded Christianity. It underlies the repellent and lamentable mindset exemplified in Cashin's story about Pater Modus. It's also incompatible with the love of one's neighbor and consequently with the love of God as well. Contrary to the stern-minded attitudes, there are things worth desiring other than the intrinsically valuable things necessary for human flourishing. And the desires for these things should not be suppressed. In fact, as Cashin's story of Pater Modus makes plain, the attempt to stamp out the desires of the heart does not lead to human excellence, as Cashin thought it did. It leads to a kind of inhuman willingness to murder one's own son in the service of a confused and reprehensible attempt at self-denial. Now I have to say that here there is an apparent paradox. As I introduced the phrase, the desires of the heart are desires which are central to a person's web of desires, but their objects are not essential to a person's flourishing. On the face of it, then, losing the objects of such desires, giving up those desires themselves, these are compatible with a person's flourishing. But the rejection of a stern-minded attitude seems to imply that a person's flourishing requires that he have desires of the heart and that he strive to have what he desires. And so it seems to imply that it's essential to a person's flourishing that he have desires of the heart. And so I seem to have said that it's essential to human flourishing that a person desire and seek to have things which are not necessary to his flourishing. In recent work, the well-known Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt has argued that it's useful for a person to have final ends. That's paradoxical too. The central idea of Frankfurt's argument is the thought that a person with no final ends at all will have a life which really lacks well-being. And so, for this reason, final ends are useful for human well-being. The apparently paradoxical claim about the desires of the heart can be understood analogously. Human beings are constructed in such a way that they naturally set their hearts on things in addition to and different from their own flourishing. And that's why confining a person's desires just to his own flourishing has something inhuman about it. A person's flourishing, therefore, also requires that he care about and seek to have things besides his own flourishing. On Frankfurt's view, having a desire for something which is not a means to anything else is a means to human well-being. On the view I've argued for here, a person's having a desire for things which are not essential to his flourishing is necessary for his flourishing. And so, although no particular thing valued as a desire of the heart is essential to a person's flourishing, human flourishing is not possible in the absence of the desires of the heart. So here's what I want to say in conclusion. For all these reasons, we can safely leave the stern-minded attitude to one side. And so it remains the case that some justification is also needed for suffering which stems from unfulfilled or frustrated desires of the heart. Theodicies which focus just on one or another variety of human flourishing as the morally sufficient reason for God's allowing evil, they are at best incomplete. Even if we give such theodicies everything they want as regards the relation between suffering and a person's flourishing, there remains the problem of suffering stemming from the loss of the desires of the heart. So the desires of the heart also need to be considered in connection with the problem of evil. For my part, I think it is possible to find a way to develop traditional theodicy to include satisfactory consideration of the problem posed by the desires of the heart. Now, I have to tell you, sadly, that complicated and challenging task is a project for a book. It's not a project for a lecture. So for today, it's enough to have reflected on the nature of the desires of the heart and to have seen their importance for human flourishing. So here's what I want to do. I want to finish just by reminding you of the Psalmist's promise with which I began. The Psalmist says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart."